Chapter 3, The War. In the fall of 1980, the war between the 8 Trays and the Rolling 60s was in full swing. 5 casualties had accrued on our side, 8 had fallen on their side. Even though people die every day in South Central, and by most any means, it was the timing and the viciousness of these killings that made the gang community stop and take notice. Escalation was the order of the day. Entire streets were turned into armed camps to be used as liberated territory, where safe meeting and mounting up could be carried out with not much as a worry about enemy gunfire. Meeting means a gang gathering to choose a riding party or group of shooters to invade enemy territory. Mounting up means starting out on the mission. This particular war is of the utmost importance. It was this very conflict that changed the politics of gang relations in South Central, a significant factor in the development of the critical climate that prevails throughout the region today. Once the 8 Trays had really fallen out and our intent at the Rolling 60s destruction was obvious, the entire Crip community split and began to side with one set or the other. We became, in effect, superpowers, not unlike the former Soviet Union and the United States. Sets whom we'd had small skirmishes with or who favored the 60s over us sided with them. Also included were their natural allies, our neighborhood sets. Neighborhood, or N-hood, is the name of a loosely knit group of sets throughout Los Angeles, including Linwood, West Covina, and Compton. The neighborhood Crips, as a whole, make up a larger part of the Crip community, quite possibly comparable to the expansive republics spread throughout the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They are like Soviet republics, but not necessarily united, as each is of a different culture, with a diversity of customs and philosophical beliefs. The neighborhoods had only been loosely associated. However, with the brutal escalation of the war, they became a united front against us and our allies. Sets began to predict the winners, a virtually impossible deed, as our war, like most gang wars, was not fought for territory or any specific goal other than the destruction of individuals, of human beings. The idea was to drop enough bodies, cause enough terror and suffering, so that they come to their senses and realize that we were the wrong set to fuck with. Their goal, I'm sure, was the same. Points were scored when individuals with prestige were hit. The aggression displayed in 1980 was unprecedented. We set a decibel level in violence that still causes some to cringe today. What most folks miserably fail to realize is that our wars are no less complicated than world wars, or wars fought to either suppress or liberate a country. The difference is not legality, but cause. Some causes are righteous and in accord with human nature, while others are reactionary and repressive. Gang wars fall somewhere in between. I can quite easily justify the retaliation on enemies for killing one of my comrades, but simultaneously I will condemn the murdering of non-combatants. Retribution is a natural reaction. It's easy to persuade the general public of your righteousness when you control major media, but those of us who control nothing are in the precarious position of having someone guess what our position is. This leaves quite a large gap for misinformation. Who fired the first shot? Who knows? But to who cares when one of theirs is lying in a pool of blood with his brains blown out? This question becomes weightless in the aftermath of a shooting where someone has died. Thus, the goal becomes the elimination of the shooter or as many of his comrades as possible. This inevitably leads to war, a full-scale mobilization of as many troops as needed to achieve the desired effect. Funerals. It was in this season that I was captured for murder. This particular incident began in my hood. I had taken my little brother's 10-speed out this day as I was venturing around the block to Shadow's house. Time seemed to fly by, and before I knew it, had fallen, and I was left in the dangerous position of having to get back home. This task would indeed be most trying, as our hood was now being clocked by not just the 60s, but their allies and our new enemies. Night was the killing time. Dreading my upcoming journey and cursing myself for not having brought a strap, I mounted the bike and started out. Pedaling fast toward the dark side of Howdale, I noticed 4 occupants in what appeared to be a blue T-Bird. They were parked on the left-hand side of the street facing me. I slowed to a precautionary coast and strained my eyes to survey the situation I was riding into. Upon further observation, I realized that the T-Bird belonged to my homeboy Sleepy. This meant the others had to be homies as well. A sigh of relief fell over me and I picked up my pace again. But then I noticed hand gestures coming from Sleepy's car. Thinking they were joking with me and clowning, I flipped them off as I approached the front of the car. Unbeknownst to me, they were trying to warn me of the imminent danger, for they had seen the carload of shooters bend the corner with their lights off moments after I rolled out of Shadow's driveway into the street. They sat motionless and waited for me to be cut down. I never saw the car until it was parallel with me and I was staring down the barrels of 5 weapons under the unfriendly faces of my enemies. Fortunately, they wanted to see who they were killing. They wanted some points, and this gave me an edge. "Look, look," exclaimed an overly excited voice from within the car. "It's Monster Cody. Shoot that ninja. Shoot him," another faceless voice shouted. Too late. By now, I had reached the front of Sleepy's car and was diving behind it in an attempt at survival. Before I hit the ground, the shooting began. Sitting parallel with Sleepy's car, they proceeded to riddle the car with bullets. I lay in the dirt and hoped they wouldn't have the heart to exit their car and see if I were hit or dead. It seemed like 5 minutes before the shooting stopped. I knew for sure the homies inside the car were dead. I waited until I heard the shooter's car screech away before I began to move or even think about coming from behind Sleepy's car. This had been a close call. Death, it seemed, was stalking me. My brushes with it were becoming more frequent and increasingly more serious. Had they used the shoot first, ask who later policy, I would have been killed. From the sound of their weaponry, they had some heavy calibers. I distinctly remember seeing an M1 carbine and some big handguns. I later found out the identity of the shooters as well. Getting up slowly so as not to be tricked into a screeching tire trick where a soldier would be waiting with the weapon when I emerged, I began to hear rustling in the car and was awestruck to find that everyone was still alive. Sleepy was sitting in the driver's seat. Next to him sat Big Lynn, who stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed in at a hefty 340 pounds. Her arms measured 22 inches around. We often used her as a disciplinary board for unruly homegirls and, to be perfectly frank, some homeboys. Behind Big Lynn was Gangster Brown, and to his left sat his younger brother Fatty. They had been sitting there for some time, slipping bad, smoking PCP. When they saw me dive around the car, they slid down in their seats. Miraculously, no one was killed, though all had suffered buckshot, strapping, and glass cuts from shattering windows. They pulled themselves from the wreckage, and that's exactly what it was. It's amazing in how a matter of seconds, a car of such expense can be reduced to a hunk of Swiss metal, absolutely useless. Standing there in the street surveying the damage, Sleepy could not believe what he saw. We counted 28 bullet holes in the body of the car, not including the individual buckshot dents. Fatty had taken a large caliber shot right through the bib of his hat. Everyone was bleeding on the arms and neck. Areas not covered by clothing were bloody. What held them from falling into shock was the PCP. Even after the shooting, they were not in total control of their faculties. I was not on PCP and was visibly shaking. I had no sedative. By now, my nerves were all but shot. Combat was starting to take its toll on me. It seemed as though I was viewing a body every other month or having brains and blood splattered all over me. Death, or the fear of death, became my constant companion. But still, my dedication, my patriotism was strong. The can't stop, won't stop mentality had taken control of my being. Trying to stir Sleepy into a retaliatory mood proved fruitless. He and the others were too intoxicated to mount any serious defense and seemed unconcerned about anything but their wounds in Sleepy's car. This goes back to what I have already explained about military personnel and combat soldiers. Although all of the victims in this case were in the military, none were actual combat soldiers. When struck, they had no immediate inclination to strike back. Often, they'd relay the assault to the combat division and a counterattack would then be carried out. Combat troops, on the other hand, would have assembled, mounted, and been en route to a designated spot before the smell of KODY cleared the air. Rapid deployment brought instant recognition to those involved as a serious group of cats bent on upholding their prestige. Disgusted at their lack of concern, I mounted the bike and continued my journey home. When I turned up to my block and had gone about 4 houses, a purple duster sped towards me and fired one shot. Either the driver or the shooter, or perhaps both, were inexperienced in the technique of doing a drive-by, because I didn't even feel the closeness of the bullet. My forward motion and their speed in the opposite direction had obviously thrown the shooter's aim off. He probably aimed directly at me, a moving target, causing his shot to go somewhere behind me, no doubt into one of the houses as I was passing. The car kept straight but picked up speed, probably thinking they had actually done something. My pace had been momentarily broken, but I never dismounted my bike. When I got to my house, my sister was standing out front. Though she had heard the shot, she had not known what had happened. Surprisingly, she was not accosted and asked to identify herself. Had the shooters found out that she was my sister, she would have been shot or kidnapped. Though our war had not yet reached the level of kidnapping and executing family members, it was being talked about as an inevitable consequence in our headlong escalation. This too pointed up the inexperience of these shooters. If they were on 69th Street, that meant they knew I lived there, and their intentions were to try to catch me or one of my homies coming from or going to my house. My combat mentality was still at its peak from the brush of death around the corner. So when I got to where my sister was standing, I yelled at her to take her ass in the house, and that she didn't know there was a goddamn war going on out here. She stared for a moment, then ran inside. Putting up Little Monster's bike, I had 1,000 thoughts running through my head. Once in my room, I sat down on the end of my bed to devise a plan in the midst of this latest attack. Usually we respond right away, but tonight there seemed to be a lull in our communication. The drums weren't beating. I phoned Sidewinder in an attempt to consolidate a riding party of able soldiers and was shocked at what I heard. The very same car that shot up Sleepy's car had also rode on Sidewinder and some other homies up in the 80s hoods. Their initial attack had been taking place on 71st Street. But this wasn't the shocker, for it was common for one car to make a full sweep of the entire neighborhood. The surprising news was that in their attempt to shoot one of our homies, they had shot and critically wounded a member of the Inglewood Bloods family, who had been creeping into our hood to shoot Sidewinder and the homies. The shooter's car met a righteous resistance in the 80s and didn't get the chance to do any damage, although shots were exchanged. When asked what they did with the blood, Sidewinder responded, "We sent him to his maker." Now I was depressed. It seemed then that we were in totally occupied territory. Hanging up the phone, I lay back on my bed and looked over at the empty bed beside me. My younger brother, Little Monster, had been captured for an armed robbery along with Little Harv and a woman named Speedy, a close associate of the hood and a firm supporter of the criminal class. He had been given 6 months in camp. I wished he was there because he'd be down to launch an attack from right here. But bro was not there and Crazy D was still in the hall. Shit. I felt trapped. I had to do something. I retrieved my double barrel from beneath the dresser and checked it for munition. Then I went out and got back on bro's bike. Holding the shotgun, which had been sawed off for stealth, across the handlebars, I pedaled west toward the borderline that separated our hood from the 60s. Wearing my combat black, I crossed Western Avenue and entered their hood on the left flank, in what today we call the first parallel. I made my way cautiously up 69th Street to Horseman Junior High School. Rumor had it that they had been using Horseman as a meeting place, for they had still failed to produce a park for their meeting and mounting place. I circumvented the school on its left side, which was on 71st. Then I parked my bike and traveled on foot. I hopped the school fence with the shotgun in my waistband, landing on the other side with a thud. When I got to the lunch area, I was disappointed to find no one there. Had they been there at the school, this is where they would have been found, because the lunch area was covered with the roof. Moving now on instinct, I continued through the lunch area and out to the makeshift bungalows, which had been constructed to allow school to continue while the administration building was being renovated. I began to hear music in the distance. The closer I came to the north side of the school, the louder the music got. Finally, I said to myself, someone to shoot. Creeping slowly toward the area I believed the music and now loud talking was coming from, I kept a vigilant eye out for sentries or stragglers who might announce my presence and blow my surprise attack. And, of course, the very real possibility existed that if I did not strike swiftly, causing much damage and confusion, they could mount a response and trap me in the school. I had brought only 2 shells, both buckshot. At each corner, I crouched and perked from a low position. Combat training I had learned from old war movies. But as I negotiated a corner, I found no one there. Where were they? Then a terrifying thought occurred to me. The roof. These motherfuckers were on the roof. This gave them a vantage point far superior to my ground level position. But the sound disproved my theory. It was an even level sound and not, as I had surmised, an above level sound. My second thought was confirmed as I made my way around the next set of bungalows. They were not even in the schoolyard, but outside its gate, parked on 68th Street, talking as they played the car radio, beer bottles on the hood and roof of the car. Luckily for me, they were on my side of the street, for they had been on the other side, I would have not been able to maximize my damage. Not only did I have to shoot through the fence, but my targets were in the street. This put about 17 feet between us. I had 00 buckshot, which would compensate for the distance, but my weapon was sawed off. This meant my shot would be more of a spray than a solid impact. Realizing that my transportation was clear across the school, I debated whether I should expand one or both barrels, expend one and use one to secure my escape, or pull both triggers at once, using the tremendous sound as a diversionary tactic and hoping to realize my intent, which was a funeral or two. Making my decision, I stepped to the gate, stuck the barrels through and shouted, "Gangsta!" Boom, ba-boom!